Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Chatham House discussion of Brazil's economy beyond the elections. We're speaking one day after the first round of voting in Brazil's 2022 general elections, and we'll be looking at what's ahead for the next administration. The presidential election will go to a runoff vote on October 30th between former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and current President Jair Bolsonaro. Yesterday, Lula earned 48.4% to Bolsonaro's 43.2% of valid votes in the first round. Bolsonaro widely outperformed polls, and his allies performed well both in Brazil's Congress and in local elections, which we'll be discussing. I'm Catherine Osborne. I'm a journalist based in Rio de Janeiro and the writer of Foreign Policy's Latin America Brief. And we're joined today by three wonderful panelists. Mansueto Almeida is the chief economist at BTG Pactual, the largest investment bank in Latin America. He served in Brazil's economy ministry from 2016 to 2020 and was Brazil's treasury secretary for the latter part of that time. Richard Lapper is a writer and consultant. He's an associate fellow at Chatham House US and the Americas program. He worked for the Financial Times for 20 years and published a book about Bolsonaro's Brazil entitled Beef, Bible, and Bullets. Monica De Bolli is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the former director for Latin American Studies and Emerging Markets at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies. Today, we're going to talk some about the election and the outlook for Brazil in the period to come. We're coming off a period in which President Bolsonaro, aided by Economy Minister Paulo Guedes, aimed to implement economic reforms around fiscal responsibility and market incentives. And while Brazil remains a diverse economy with strong sectors, including agriculture, fintech, and services, the country is facing economic headwinds and political uncertainty. And we really can't have this discussion without focusing on the politics and specifically yesterday's results. So that's what we're going to begin with, looking at the results with Richard. Each of the speakers will give around 5 minutes of initial comments before I ask them some questions, and then we'll follow with questions from the audience. So please go ahead and feel free throughout the event to start typing questions into the chat on Zoom. This event is on the record and it's being recorded. So we'll go ahead and kick off our comments with Richard.
Thanks very much. I mean, yeah, this election has been a bit of a huge surprise, really, to me, at least, in the sense that the polls have been predicting a win for Lula. The big debate last week was whether Lula could win in the first round or whether he wouldn't achieve the 50% plus to getting into the second round. But really, over the course of the last 18 months, the polls had Lula between 7 and 15 points in front of Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro's vote seemed to have a ceiling to it of about 37, 38% maximum. And in fact, what's happened is that Bolsonaro's vote has been a lot higher. He won 43% of the vote. So he's only 5 points behind Lula. The center candidate, Simone Tebet from the Democratic Movement Party, and the center-left, Ciro Gomes, scored far fewer votes than had been expected. So we go into a second round where, that Lula's still ahead and he's still favorite to win. Now, the other thing that happened yesterday is that the elections for the Congress and for the governorships in Brazil, which are hugely important in the political system, did not go well for Lula. In Congress, the center, the right really strengthened their grip on both the lower house and the Senate. We had the center parties that have been declining, really, the PSDB and the PMDB, which were the pivots around which Brazilian politics worked during the 1990s, the 2000s, that were hit in the 2010s by Lava Jato and the recession, really have performed extremely badly. So that narrative has continued. The balance has really shifted further to the right, and there are two big blocks of right-wing representatives in the Senate. One is the people loyal to the Liberal Party, which is Bolsonaro's latest party, one of the 10 parties that he's been associated with in his 30-year political career. And the other is the parties linked to what is known in Brazil as the Central, which is a group of physiological, self-seeking parties of the center-right. They together really control the Congress. They've got, on my calculation, and this is very rough, I've made it some ridiculous hour in this morning, but they've got about 330 of the lower house seats of 517 lower house seats. So they really have the whip hand. I mean, Lula's own left-wing alliance, which is built around the PT, 180 seats in the lower house. In the Senate, the picture's even more dramatically in favor of the right. And really, the thing that took my attention last night was the way in which a number of key figures in Bolsonaro's government, who were seen as being a bit of an aberration, really. People, I mentioned their names, Eduardo Pazuello, who was a catastrophic health minister, a general, one of many military people serving in Bolsonaro's government, who presided over the disasters of pandemic management in Brazil, when Brazil was hit harder than, as hard as any country, really. He has been returned to the lower house with a vote, with more votes in Rio de Janeiro than any other candidate for deputy. So that's an incredible turnaround, really. Then we've had various ministers, Teresa Cristina, Damares Alves. Damares, well known as a kind of very strong social conservative and evangelical. Marcos Pontes, who was the Minister of Science. They've all come back into the Senate. Sergio Moro, who was Bolsonaro's justice minister, and of course sentenced Lula, pursued Lula through the courts in the Lava Jato case, resigned, split from Bolsonaro in 2020. He's back now as a senator for Paraná State. And Hamilton Mourão, the deputy president, has won a Senate seat in Rio Grande do Sul in the south. What we've seen is a real wave of support for conservatives and people close to the Bolsonaro camp. And I think the results show a big divide in Brazil between some of the cities, the northeast, which is poorer and generally more pro-Lula, and the west of the country. The west of the Amazon has gone pretty much to Bolsonaro. The center-west, which is Brazil's grain belt, has gone very, very wealthy grain belt, and the southeast has largely gone to Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is one in 14 of the 27 states. So this is a bit of a turn up. The governorship elections, which many have gone to second rounds, but where there's no overall winner at this stage. But the balance so far definitely favors Bolsonaro. He's won the governorship he's retained the governorship of Rio de Janeiro, for example. He's got a very good chance, I think, of winning the governorship of Sao Paulo. Now, Sao Paulo's 22% of votes in Brazil. So this is one of the biggest electoral constituencies. And this will make it very, very difficult to move on to the question of what this means. It makes it very difficult, even if Lula is able to win at the end of October. It gives him very little room for maneuver in terms of how he is going to run his government. This is not back to 2003. Lula's in a very much more difficult situation. I think, he's going to try to look over the course of the next 4 weeks to appeal to the center, to appeal to the agribusiness constituency, the evangelical constituency, that are key parts of Bolsonaro's voting blocks. He'll probably appoint someone like Enrique Meirelles, the conservative banker who is is part of a center-right party, but is a crucial figure in Lula's first two administrations. Again, try and reassure the markets, win the private sector over. Even if he wins, it's still going to be very difficult because, two huge problems that Brazil faces, and I'm sure that Mansueto and Monica will be able to talk in far greater detail about this than myself. But I mean, the fiscal problems that Brazil faces now after the spending that Bolsonaro has engaged in recent months are very significant. There's a huge primary deficit of, I think, more than 7% of GDP. That has to be looked at. There's all sorts of other issues. It means that any of Lula's chances of introducing social reforms like tightening up labor laws, for example, which he promised to do, would be almost impossible to achieve, I think. I think uncertainty is still likely to be a factor which will undermine international confidence, although today the immediate reaction on the markets has been fairly positive, with the real being marked up in early trading.
Yeah, Richard.
That's kind of a rough roundup of stuff anyway.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Richard, for that context. And understanding this and sort of acknowledging Bolsonaro's strong performance last night and his allies' strong performance, could we go to Mansueto a bit and discuss some of these economic challenges and understand a bit about where Brazil is right now economically and where were the discussions about priorities before yesterday's election? And then we'll return a little bit to the political limitations and just the general political outlook introduced yesterday. So Mansueto, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you. Let me break and talk a little bit about the economic numbers. There is one surprise, concerning Bolsonaro government and the government that came before Bolsonaro, Temer's government. That in the last 6 years, Brazil was able to approve many important reforms. At the beginning, Temer's government, it was a very weak government in terms of popularity. The approval rate of Temer was very, very low. Just to give you an idea, Temer finished his term with the lowest approving rate since President Collor in 1990, and President Collor was impeached in Brazil back in 1990s. In 1991, 1992, he was impeached. And Temer was very unpopular, but despite that, Brazil approved many important reforms. Approved a very important, fiscal rule that we call the Spending Cap Bill to control the growth of the public sector, federal government expenditure. Approved a labor reform, and also approved a new law concerning the regulation of state companies. And then came Bolsonaro, that was elected in 2018. And despite being very weak in terms of political support in the Congress, because at the beginning of his government, Bolsonaro didn't have a political support. But, the Congress approved one of the most important reforms in Brazil that we tried for many, many years, for 20 years, and it failed. And then finally, we approved it back in 2019, which was the pension reform. And it was very important to approve the pension reform because we were talking about a country that, people used to get retired around, 54 years old before 2019. It was very, very young. And finally, in a new government with our political support, we approved the pension reform in 2019. And after that, last year, Brazil approved another very important reform that was very unpopular in Brazil. 8 years ago, it was almost impossible, to debate that reform, which is central bank independency. Last year, Brazil approved the central bank independence, which is a very sensitive reform. 8 years ago, it was a very unpopular topic among politicians. But, in the middle of COVID, we approved the central bank independence. In addition to that, Brazil approved many important reforms in terms of regulatory framework that was very successful in attracting private investment to infrastructure projects, to ports, to airports, to sewage, to railways, to highways. So, when you put everything together, I think we finished this government with some, let's say, a big surprise coming from the economic indicators, because everybody 2 years ago, including myself, I was expecting that the numbers will be much worse, and that is not the case. If you go back 2 years ago in 2020, when the world in Brazil was hit by COVID-19, we had in Brazil a primary deficit in 2020 of 10% of GDP, and a fiscal deficit, when you include the interest payments, of 14% of GDP. This is quite similar to what happened in the UK and the United States. The surprise came in the next year, in 2021. Everybody was expecting another primary deficit for the public sector. And then we had a primary surplus of 0.7% of GDP. And then this year, 2022, probably we finished this year with another primary surplus of 1.2% of GDP. So these are good numbers. Back in 2020, we finished the year with a gross debt to GDP at 88% of GDP. And we're expecting to finish this year, 2022, with a gross debt to GDP of 77% of GDP. So, I mean, much lower than what it was 2 years ago, and a little bit higher than what it was 2019. 2019, the gross debt to GDP in Brazil was 74.4%, and we finished this year with a gross debt around 77% of GDP. So, I mean, this is very good vis-a-vis what we expected 2 years ago. And in addition to that, you know, the GDP growth this year, it's a big surprise, because at the beginning of the year, everybody was expecting, because of a very high interest rate, because of the monetary policy to fight inflation, we're expecting that the GDP growth will be near zero, and probably will finish this year with a GDP growth, a real GDP growth of 3%. And last year we had a real GDP growth of 4.8%. If you look to the numbers of the labor market in Brazil, you know, the last number that was published by the government official statistic office, our unemployment rate today is 9%, and it's the lowest number since 2015. So at the end, you know, the economy, the numbers, the economic numbers are better than expected. You know, part of that is linked to commodities, because you talk about a country that 80% of exports is linked to commodities. 54% of Brazilian export is for products. It's oil, iron ore, soybean, and meat. So, I mean, we had a huge advantage, a huge growth, I mean, linked to the commodity sector. But when you look ahead, despite all these short-term good numbers, you have, you know, a massive challenge. First of all, I mean, nobody's expecting that, you know, the commodity price will continue to grow. It's quite the opposite. We might have some recession, and if this happens, the commodity price could go down, and this could affect the Brazilian GDP growth and the revenue as well. And second, despite all these good fiscal numbers in the short term, you know, next year, it doesn't matter who will win the election. Probably one of the most important social programs in Brazil that used to call Bolsa Família, and now the name is Auxílio Brasil. It's a social transfer to low-income families. This program used to be 0.5% of GDP from 2003 to 2019. And now this program probably will be something near 1.5% of GDP, 3 times higher than what it was before COVID. In a country that, you know, still needs to do a fiscal adjustment, because although you had a primary surplus last year and this one as well, everybody's expecting next year primary deficit of 0.5% of GDP. You know, in the best case scenario, it could be worse. And this means that in order to control the growth of the debt to GDP, you know, to stall the growth of the debt to GDP, Brazil needs to run a primary surplus of at least 2% of GDP. So we're talking about a fiscal effort, a fiscal adjustment that the next government will need to do around 2.5 percentage points of GDP. And it is not easy to do it, because, you know, it's very difficult to cut expenditure, you know, in the context of Brazilian economy, because over 90% of the budget is mandatory, and you don't have space to cut public investment. Just to give you an idea, the tax burden in Brazil is 34% of GDP. The tax burden at the federal level is around 21% of GDP. And you know, the public investment next year, that's already on the budget for the next year, at the federal level, will be 0.2% of GDP. So it's almost nothing. We don't have space to cut public investment anymore, and to cut all the other, you know, items of the budget is very, very difficult. So I mean, the next government needs to do a fiscal adjustment of 2.5 percentage point of GDP. That will not be easy to cut expenditure, and on the other hand, it will not be easy as well to increase taxes, because the total revenue collection in Brazil, the tax burden is around 34% of GDP. It's quite similar to UK. So you don't have space to cut taxes, and it'll be very difficult to increase taxes as well. So I mean, a good scenario depends a lot on some things that is not directly controlled by the government. Like, for instance, this continued boom in the revenue. In the last 2 years, the total revenue collection in Brazil for the public sector as a whole went up by 2.5 percentage point of GDP. But you know, this is linked to inflation, because 45% of the revenue collection in Brazil is indirect tax that is linked to prices. So when you have inflation, it helps a lot in terms of, you know, increasing the revenue collection, and it's linked to commodity, and you cannot count on that, you know, to have a good scenario for revenue collection. So it's you know, it's a very challenging scenario, in a country that, although you finish this year with a debt around 77% of GDP, it is still very high for emerging economy, for comparing Brazil with all the other emerging economy. So, and a country that people expect a lot from the government. So, I mean, again, it doesn't matter who wins the election. It's a difficult scenario that you need to talk a lot with Congress. A Congress that will be today, that will be in the next term, much stronger than what it used to be 4, 10 years ago. Because nowadays the Congress control, a big portion of the budget. So, that's the challenge. It's not easy. So you have, let's say, a difficult times ahead.
Thank you so much, Massueto. That discussion of the difficult times ahead, massive challenges on the economic front, as Massueto mentioned, are connected to challenges on the social front. He discussed how much Brazil is spending on its social welfare programs right now. And the new Congress will be so influential in making these decisions. And so when we go to Monica, I'm curious about who is exactly this Brazilian right that has been voted into Congress, again, in such large numbers. And what do we know about what their economic priorities are, and also their other political priorities? I know, Monica, you've been studying what direction the Brazilian right has taken under Bolsonaro. And so can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So good morning to everyone and good afternoon to everyone else. I guess good morning is just myself and Massueto at this point. I'm very happy to be here, and it's always a pleasure to speak at Chatham House. So the question of what's happened in the political landscape of Brazil is an extremely important one, and one that can't be exaggerated from the point of view of not just these results that we have seen coming out of yesterday, but also kind of the long run implications, as well as how did we get here? That question, how did we get here? I think there's been very little attention to the how did we get here question. I mean, not exactly little attention, I guess. There's been attention, but attention focused on the wrong aspects of the how did we get here question. The far right in Brazil has been a project for a long time. It is not something that came out of the blue. It certainly gives that impression because the elections of 2018 kind of gave us the impression that, oh, and suddenly here's Bolsonaro and he's presenting himself as this anti-establishment candidate and he sweeps all the votes. But it really didn't happen like that. It has happened through many, many years of a conjunction of factors that have come together and that have really formed a movement. And these factors do include what we call the evangelicals, which, may I say, is a very, very misleading way to refer to these groups, because the evangelicals actually encompass a lot of different groups within that particular, let's say, religious denomination. There are progressist evangelicals, there are evangelicals which are not involved in politics, and then you have a more, if I may say so, fundamentalist group of evangelicals, which has become increasingly political. That's not a novel phenomenon. That's been happening since the 90s, and it has been well documented by academics in Brazil how much that particular movement has grown. Back in 2018 or 2019, I think it was, I published a paper that looked at the municipalities where these particular groups within the evangelical community had the largest participation according to the 2010 census, and whether or not there was an association with the Bolsonaro vote. And lo and behold, what I found was that there was an extreme association between these more fundamentalist religious evangelical groups and the Bolsonaro vote. So, you know, the connections with religion have been there for a while. The growth of these groups and the growth of these groups within politics has been there for a while. And now we have the connection with the agribusiness folks. And so this far right movement that has shaped up in Brazil over the last few years is really a coalition of religious movements coupled with agribusiness and the let's say what agribusiness in Brazil aspires to become in terms of economic power and political power, because they have both. They're present in Congress. So when we look at the composition of the far right, that's what the far right basically is. If we just simplify it in terms of these groups, it holds obviously extremely conservative views, but it has a very convincing narrative for what has plagued Brazil over the past few years and why it is that the country hasn't really advanced. And I think when we're trying to kind of root out, these origins of the far right, all of it connects with the 2013 protests in Brazil, because at that point, there was a manifestation of political dissatisfaction. It was extremely diffuse, but these protests were extremely large. And what's interesting about 2013 and what we have to keep in mind is that even though you had all segments of Brazilian society protesting in that particular year, in June of 2013, by and large, a lot of those demonstrations were organized by the so-called rising middle class, or the middle class that had risen under Lula. So this is the classe C. This is the class C, what we came to call the class C, or the new middle class in Brazil. And I think one of the most interesting phenomena in terms of the growth of the far right in Brazil is watching particularly this group of people. It's a very large group of people. It's a large group of people that gained social mobility under the Lula years. So they basically got to where they are now, or to where they have been, because many of them have fallen back, but they got to where they are now because of the policies that were put in place in the Lula years, and of course, the very beneficial external scenario that dominated that period from 2002 to 2010. And that is en masse the group of people that have switched to Bolsonaro. And these are people who, where do they live? Yes, some of them live in rural areas, and many of them live in the peripheral of urban areas where these evangelical churches are very present. And so there's a sociological phenomenon here that hasn't been, I think, well studied enough, and that hasn't been looked at enough, and which, because it hasn't been looked at enough, lent this element of surprise to yesterday's elections. Because if we look at the numbers, as Richard was telling us before, if you look carefully at the numbers, the big surprise there were lots of surprises, but there were surprises in Congress, as Richard pointed out. There were surprises in the gubernatorial races, and there was a big surprise in the Bolsonaro vote. We did not expect Bolsonaro to, or at least the polls were not showing that Bolsonaro would get as many votes as he did. Lula fell within the margin of error, according to the polls, but Bolsonaro fell well outside the margin of error. And where did these votes come from? Yes, some of them came from, Ciro Gomes and Simone Tebet, the two other candidates who were running. But a lot of that vote also came from people who simply did not manifest their vote in the polls. And who are these people? Well, I wager that a lot of these people are precisely the ones that I'm talking about. And what you see behind the scenes now is this consolidation of this far right movement, which we're calling Bolsonarismo for lack of a better name, but that's really a misnomer, because the far right is much bigger than Bolsonaro. So it won't really matter if we're looking, to the next 3 weeks. It won't really matter if Bolsonaro wins or loses in the runoff vote, because the fact is that the far right is well consolidated, well established, and very much alive in Brazil. And so we need to think about that, and we need to think about where do things go from here, and what is it that they have, what are their proposals, and what is it that they have in mind. There are a couple of things, or at least there are a couple of hints of what it is that they have in mind. And these hints, they lie in certain groups that have popped up in the social media sphere. There's one particular group. It is actually quite large in terms of viewership. They have a YouTube channel. They're called Brasil Paralelo, or Parallel Brazil, putting it differently. And they have this YouTube channel with a very, very large following. And they espouse, I think, the views that you could very much associate with what this far-right movement really represents. And that is, on the one hand, they have, the entire cultural wars agenda in their hands. So that's one side of the equation. And of course, the religious movements and everything that comes with that, the religious fundamentalist movement. And on the other side of the equation, agribusiness as the salvation of Brazil. So they articulate everything around agribusiness. So, and the argument goes, Brazil is an agricultural powerhouse. It is a country that has a comparative advantage in that sphere. It has an agribusiness sector that is very modern and developed. And the world, as it is right now, and it is very convincing because, of course, there is an element of truth to this. The world is going to need, as we go forward, the world is going to need food. And who is better placed to provide that? Well, the agribusiness sector in Brazil, because there's a lot of land, there's a lot of territory. There has already been a lot of advancement in the agribusiness sector in Brazil. That's where investment should be going to, the narrative goes, so that biotechnological development can happen, and you can actually reindustrialize the country via the agribusiness sector. The catch is, there are two things they say that you need in order to do this. And these two things are, on the one hand, you need to massively deregulate the economy. And by deregulating the economy, they refer back to the minimal state. Remember, this was in the Bolsonaro kind of rhetoric back in 2018. So they articulate that in talking about the agribusiness sector as the sector that is going to actually generate sustainable growth in Brazil. So you need to give them space. You need to give them space to do business. So you need to deregulate. And here they're talking about environmental laws. They're not saying it, but they're talking about environmental laws. So going even further than Bolsonaro has gone in dismantling what Brazil currently has. If you hear them speak about the Amazon, they see absolutely no issue in expanding the so-called agricultural frontier. So they're very much for pushing, they don't say it, but for pushing the agricultural frontier. And that means deforestation, which of course is the word that they don't say. And on the other hand, so space, so when they're talking about space, they're talking about, on the one hand, not having regulations, and on the other hand, being able to push and to expand and to have more territory. So this is their view. This is where they're going. And of course, if you then try to bridge this with what Lula is proposing and the people he has around him, people like Marina Silva and others, this is a direct conflict, right? This is a direct conflict. Yes. And because they have now become such important players in Congress, you can see that the two agendas don't match up. And so one of the big issues I think we have is how do you actually coordinate, or how does Lula negotiate with them? Because there are agendas.
Thank you so much, Monica. That's a fantastic point. And I wanted to jump over to Mansueto, actually, based on Monica's comment about, many of the right-wing lawmakers who are now back in Congress appear to have a deregulation agenda. And I thought it was also so interesting to hear about low ability to meet expectations of Brazil's rising middle class. And looking historically, we're coming off a decade of much lower Brazilian growth than the previous one when Lula was first in office. And Mansueto, I've heard you in other interviews speak about the need to, as tough as it is with all the challenges that we have facing the next administration, the need to also try to get Brazil on a higher growth trajectory than it's currently on. And it seems like these disaffected, potentially new middle class voters who have been more sympathetic to Bolsonaro aren't convinced that the government can provide them with a better standard of life. There are turns to religion and online communities and et cetera, and you can talk about all these elements have led to the strength of the current right. But can you talk, Mansueto, about Brazil needing to be on a higher growth trajectory and communicate this to its citizens? And what are some of the steps that can be taken on the economic front to try to activate some specific sectors that could be potentially higher growth sectors in the economy over the next administration?
Well, that's a good question. It's not easy to answer that, but let me stress first that it doesn't matter if you're talking here in Brazil about the right or the left. Everybody expects a strong role of the government, of the state. Just to give an idea, despite all this very interesting debate that Monica told us about, the minimum state, you're talking about a country that you have a public sector expenditure that is over 40% of GDP. So Brazil, it's a country that people expect a lot from the state. We have, a very big welfare state, but it's not very effective because, when you calculate, the cut income, the fall income inequality before and after the state intervention is very low. The problem here in Brazil is not that we need to increase expenditure. It's different from all the other Latin American countries. The problem here in Brazil is that we need to change the composition of the expenditure, and it's not easy because what we call middle class in Brazil, they demand more progressive expenditure, more progressive taxation. But on the other hand, we don't see this debate going on because it's true that the left in Brazil is talking about a different model of development. But I have the feeling that it's not much different from the right. Everybody here expects that the state you lead development, will push for higher growth, and here in Brazil we have a problem of very, very low growth of productivity. It's a long-term phenomenon. It's not for the last 3, 4, 5 years. It's in the last 10, 20 years. So if you look ahead, in order to Brazil to grow more and please the middle class, first of all, the only sector that I see that could push the short-term growth is agriculture sector. It's service, of course, but service, the productivity is very low. And a little bit, the oil sector. I know that in all over the world, the capex, the investment in oil sector is going down, but it's different from Brazil because in the last 12 years, we invested a lot in the pre-salt oil field. So if you look to the production curve of the oil sector in Brazil, you increase a lot in the next 8 years. It's different from the rest of the world. And the agriculture sector still have access to subsidized credit, to a very low tax burden, and the agriculture sector in Brazil is very competitive. So they will continue to grow. In terms of the growth of the industry in Brazil, that is so important. It's an open question. We have very important industrial firms here, but the majority, the industrial sector here, the manufacturing production in Brazil is pretty much flat in the last, let's say, 10 years. So it's an open question whether or not you have kind of let's say economy that will grow around 2.5% per year in the next 4 years. It's possible it is because you have a new phenomenon, which is the investment on infrastructure. Based on all the concessions that already happened, we have, in the coming 4 or 5 years, a capex, investment, a flow of investment on infrastructure around 0.8% of GDP, and this could help the growth. So, I think, the short-term growth, it's easy in the long-term growth, because if you look to Brazil for the next 10, 15 years, then, the challenge is much higher because it depends on the quality of institution, the quality of education, depends, on sustainable productivity growth. So when I look to Brazil in the long term, I have much more open question and doubts than looking to Brazil in the short term. In the short term, if the next government, I mean, makes some commitment in terms of the fiscal adjustment, and also try to approve the administrative reform and tax reform, I think, we could perform relatively well, grow around 2 to 2.5% per year. It's not that much, but have in mind something quite interesting. We will start next government with unemployment rate around 8%. 8% of unemployment rate in Brazil is almost full employment. So I don't think that the labor market will be a major problem in the next government. It's quite the opposite. I think that the next government, you might face some problem with lack of qualified labor force, lack of qualified skillful workers. So I mean, the challenge for the next government is give the right signals that it doesn't matter who in the election, you have some responsibility concerning the fiscal rules. Of course, I mean, there is this debate to change the fiscal rules. Okay, change it, but put something in place and show that you'll be fiscal responsible. And second, I mean, some commitment in terms of continuing to approve reforms. Although, I mean, we don't have the slightest idea what's the, let's say, consensus about reforms, about tax reform, for instance. Brazil has a high tax burden, and we don't have space to cut that, but we can do a tax reform, improving the tax rules, making it more simple, which is not easy because you have many special tax regime, and every time that you try to change that, the middle class, the entrepreneurs, they are against the change this rule. So you have many challenges ahead. It's possible to please the middle class. In the short term with growth, it is possible to please the middle class in terms of improving economic conditions. But again, I mean, we're talking about a country with a very, very high income inequality. It's still very high poverty rates, and it will not be easy to change that in the next 3 to 4 years.
Thank you so much, Mansueto. I'm going to go to Richard with one more question, and then after that, start reading some questions from the audience. So I want to remind everyone that you can go in the Q&A area and type in some questions here. We already have some good ones coming in. Richard, I wanted to ask you about, it appears that approaching the second round of the election, Lula has already looked to the center quite a bit and made all sorts of pledges about having a more pro-reform agenda economically. It appears that he would implement, less potential heavy spending than he would have if he didn't have Alckmin as a running mate or made many of these alliances. Speaking about Bolsonaro and the potential possibility that he could win in the second round, I wanted to ask you about what his administration has shown us about what happens when his pledges of a liberal economic agenda and liberal economic reforms interact with this Congress that he had in his term that you've written about. You've written about the caucuses, the Beef Bible Bullet Caucus. Mansueto has spoken about some of the reforms that did happen, pension reform, central bank, a long process of central bank independence, finalized under Bolsonaro's administration. But how did these congressmen who composed his base affect his economic policy? And, what does that tell us about his potential second administration and what we could expect from them on the economy front?
Well, we could spend another 2 or 3 hours talking about that. I mean, but let me just say that I agree completely with Monica. The point she makes that this right-wing movement is not new, that it's been long in the making. Just one factoid: 1980, Brazil had 6% Protestant population. It now has, according to the most recent polling, 1 in 3 is Protestant. In that group, the most rapidly growing are, as Monica says, the fundamentalists, the neo-Pentecostals, this homegrown group of neo-Pentecostal churches, which has been pretty much solidly Bolsonarista. This is a very important sector. It's very significant, I think, that Lula, during his campaign, has tried to deal with the fragmented character of evangelism. He's tried to work I know Petista activists in various places who've tried to work with pastores from evangelical churches. Have tried to work with him on the social agenda. It's not easy. And Lula clearly hasn't made a huge amount of progress. I suspect that the evangelical population, and particularly the more fundamentalist part of it, voted very heavily for Bolsonaro and his supporters this weekend. So in terms of what, and the other point I think is worth making in terms of this very long period of gestation about this right-wing movement is that in many respects, it's a reaction to liberalism in Brazil. You know, the evangelicals are reacting to social liberalism. The environment, the agribusiness movement, particularly, I think, not so much the big agribusiness groups in Brazil that have bought into a green agenda, certainly in rhetorical terms, but the smaller, more marginal, medium-sized farmers in the Amazon that are doing a lot of the deforestation, the guys who are doing the garimpos, the guys who are doing logging, all these kind of guys. They're the guys who are reacting against the environmental agenda, against the green agenda, and that's a very big part of Bolsonaro's base, and it's one of the reasons why we saw Bolsonaro doing so well in the Amazon. The whole west of the Amazon voted for Bolsonaro. You know, the third element of this, of course, is the security agenda. You know, it's Beef, Bible, and Bullets, you know, is the title of the book that I wrote, and the bullets agenda is also very significant because there's a lot of hardline opposition to liberal approaches towards crime. Now, this is a complex matter and not something, you know, you can sum up in a half a minute or something, but I mean, it is, I think that we've got to see this right-wing movement as a long process of formation, very difficult for Lula to deal with it. He will try to buy off certain elements of the Central, and one of the advantages that he'll have is that Central are completely viable. I mean, these are politicians who will go to the highest bidder. I think if he wins, he will be talking, he'll already be talking to Artur Lira, the president of the lower house, to Pacheco, who's likely to be the president of the upper house, to Ciro Nogueira, who's Bolsonaro's chief of staff. He'll be talking to these guys, trying to get some sort of deal. The problem is that it'll take Brazil a long way away from the kind of reforms it needs to get the growth that's necessary to provide. I mean, Brazil's got a state that's dysfunctional in many respects. So I'm not optimistic, quite honestly. I mean, the scale of the deficit, I think I said earlier that it's the primary deficit that's huge. It's the nominal deficit that's more than 6-7%. But you know, this is a big problem. He's got to deal with these things. And I think it's going to be quite a turbulent period, whether or not Lula wins. The right are part of the equation, this new right, and it's, you know, this complex alliance of right-wing interests. It's part of Brazil's a conservative country with a lot of vested interests. It's going to be tough.
Thank you so much, Richard. I have a question for Monica. I'm going to go to questions from the audience now. So thank you guys so much for sending them in, and we'll be able to read several of them. This question is about a very specific challenge. It's from Ana Julia Castro Fernandes, and she says, my question is about what's been called the secret budget, which is essentially the ability for lawmakers to hand out money with low transparency that has been revealed in the past few months here. How can investors trust a government that allows this lack of transparency, lack of accountability, and mismanagement to something so key and serious for any country's fiscal policy? And are we likely to continue to see more of this practice with Lula or Bolsonaro?
So that's an excellent question, and it allows me to just add a point to what I was saying before. One of the elements I think that was completely disregarded in terms of looking at what would possibly happen in the congressional elections, including because everybody was so focused on the presidential elections, was precisely the role of the secret budget in bringing in these people who were former Bolsonaro ministers into Congress. Because of course the secret budget did, you know, that was the use of the public sector for electoral purposes. So, you know, Bolsonarismo is alive and well in Brazil very much in part because of the secret budget too. So we shouldn't, leave that aside, because that's a really important point. Going forward, Lula has said that this is not what he's going to do, and he has actually condemned this practice, as have other candidates who were in the campaign. But he will, as Richard was saying, he will have to buy off the Centrão. I mean, that's just a reality. How is he going to govern if he does not buy out the Centrão? Looking at it very objectively, we now have a Congress that is way more right-wing than the Congress that we currently have, or at least we will have a Congress that's way more right-wing than the one that we currently have. So how is Lula going to negotiate these conflicting agendas, his own and the far right, without the Centrão in the middle as being the arbiter that it always is? And for that, he's going to need to buy off the Centrão. How is he going to buy off the Centrão? That we have yet to see. With Bolsonaro, well, the secret budget actually did work very well for him, as I've just said. And so should we expect more of that? Unless there's some kind of real pushback. There's been some, but there hasn't been real pushback. So unless we see real pushback, I'd say that is a newish practice that is now here to stay. We will see more of it, or something like it, if things don't change, because the reality is governing with this Congress that has a very clear agenda defined in the far right corners of it, and which do align with Bolsonaro somewhat if he does get reelected. But even so, governing with this Congress is going to involve these sorts of things. And therefore, when you ask, what are investors going to do under that scenario? Well, they should balk, they should look at this country and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? And how do we expect, things to ever look fairly normal again if these are the current political circumstances? This is why I think, more than ever in the past, anything that we say about the economy, about growth, about the fiscal account, about whatever it is that has to do with sort of the macroeconomic outlook and the macroeconomic picture is completely subject to the politics. If you don't have a good understanding of the politics and what's going on between the executive branch and the legislative branch, you won't see what's going to happen in the economy. It just won't be possible. I mean, that has always been true, but we have chosen to ignore it for a very long time. We can't ignore it anymore. That's the reality. And so for investors, the outlook is grim. And thus, the outlook for Brazil is equally grim. I mean, money is not going to flow into Brazil. It's already difficult enough with the hostility or the hostile external environment that we have coming out of a pandemic, having a stagflationary outlook for the global economy, a war still between Russia and Ukraine, the fallout of this on Europe, the problems that we see coming out of China. All of this already makes life for investment to emerging markets in general, and to Brazil in particular, extremely difficult. Add to that the political, not just turbulence, but the political opaqueness that currently exists and will continue to exist. You have a recipe for no investment. I mean, that's the truth. And in that regard, I'm with Richard. I'm very pessimistic as to, Brazil's outlook, whether it be under Lula or Bolsonaro. Of course, we're more pessimistic under Bolsonaro, but I'm very pessimistic under Lula too.
Thank you, Monica. The next question I'm going to ask to Mansueto, and it's a specific one about a scenario in which if Lula is elected president, he's made some comments recently about being interested in finally moving forward with the Mercosur European Union trade deal. And this question is from Hugh Jenkins. And the question is there any likelihood of a trade deal with Europe under Lula? And I would ask, Lula has even mentioned to the Financial Times that he might want to change some things, or at least try to, in those negotiations. Even if Congress continues with this demand for fiscal spending and there's not very many reforms possible domestically. Could we see an EU trade deal go forward under a potential Lula administration? And what do you envision it looking like?
I mean, I think so. Sometimes Lula says a lot of things during the political campaign. Sometimes very, very radical. But at the end, I don't expect that radical government. First of all, because the Congress will not allow that. Since you have this Congress that move it to the center right, it's not, a guarantee that you approve reform. But on the other hand, I think it will be a very important counterweight to any radical proposal for any government. So at the end, I think, it doesn't matter who wins the election. I think they will perceive the benefit of Brazil to move ahead with, this kind of trade agreement with European Union, with joining OECD.
Yeah, I saw Monica just raise her hand, so I might ask her to respond afterwards.
Sometimes, and another thing that is quite important, it's that we have a lot of uncertainty concerning Brazil and emerging economy as well as developing countries as well. Look to what is happening in the UK. I'm completely shocked about a country that is cutting the tax burden by 2 percentage points of GDP, increasing exponential, and causing an immense problem with the markets. And it's quite crazy because the world is a little bit crazy today. And the funny fact is that despite all this problem in Brazil with the Congress and uncertainty, the FDI this year is increasing by 70% vis-a-vis the last year. Somehow the foreign investors, are coming. I know I agree with many things that was said here, but at the end, if we're talking about renewable energy, all the major companies in the world are coming to Brazil to invest in renewable energy. Many agriculture sector, a lot of investment coming to the agriculture sector, to infrastructure investment as well. So, you have a lot of uncertainty. It's not clear what will be, the commitment to trade openness of both governments. Sometimes I thought that Bolsonaro will not push this agenda, but at the end, Brazil had a good, move it a little bit ahead. People in Brazil, especially the entrepreneurs, they're very protectionist. And when you look at what's happening all over the world, the countries are much more protectionist today than they used to be 10 years ago. So it's a little bit uncertainty. But again, the starting point matters a lot. And Brazil, we cannot go through the wrong direction, because otherwise you have a downgrade of rating agency and things will get worse. This new government, doesn't matter who will be this new government, if he doesn't give the right message to the market, he will hide a problem. And I don't expect this will happen.
Thank you, Mansueta. I'm going to go to Monica because she had a comment. And additionally, I wanted to say that we have one final question here, and I'm going to ask that folks respond to it and give any final comments that you'd like to give, beginning with Monica. The question is from Melanie Avila, and it is, how would a Lula or Bolsonaro win affect Brazil's political and economic role in the region? So any comments you want to make about the election and Brazil's role in the region? And we'll start with you, Monica.
Okay, thank you. Well, I respectfully disagree with Mansueto. I don't really see any possibility of Mercosur EU advancing under either government, certainly not under Bolsonaro's, because the environment has been a major sticking point. And under Lula, unless he really is able to revamp the entire structure of environmental legislations and environmental agencies, and that's a very tall order because, of course, these agencies have been taken over by Bolsonaristas to a very large extent. So it would mean, basically taking these people out and putting others in. It's an effort. It's not something that you can do quickly. I also don't see Mercosur EU moving forward. So the climate is a major deal for the European Union. And Brazil is currently a pariah on the environmental front. This isn't going to change from day to night, regardless of who becomes president. So I don't think the situation is that easy. On the question itself, can you remind me what the question was?
Sure, it's about regional relations.
Relations. Okay.
So how would either a Lula or a Bolsonaro administration affect Brazil's political and economic role in the region?
So Brazil has been very insular Brazil has been very insular, period. We can just say that. Under Lula 20 years ago, under Lula, there was a lot of the foreign policy, the external policy had a lot of this South-South bent to it. And at the time, of course, there had been what many political scientists called the pink tide in the region. So Lula had a lot of people who he actually had relations with, and those relations, were sort of well established. It never really went anywhere because it's not as if Brazil actually made big, trade deals or investment deals across the board with other Latin American countries. But at least on the geopolitics and the diplomatic front, things did work somewhat better than perhaps they had in the past. Not so much, actually, because Fernando Henrique had good relations across the region, too. Bolsonaro essentially broke that off. And, Bolsonaro is a nationalist at heart. And so is the far right, by the way. We should add that. There is an anti-globalization, a very clear anti-globalization agenda on the part of the far right. So they are nationalists. And being nationalists, they don't really have the concern of establishing relations with the neighbors or establishing relations with the region. And we saw that under Bolsonaro. Over the past 4 years, okay, there was a pandemic in the middle, and of course that got in the way, but it could have gone the other way, right? It could have gone in the way of, given that the pandemic is something that has spillover across borders and Latin American borders are very porous, there could have been some kind of coordination, at least on the public health front. And we didn't even see that under the Bolsonaro administration. So another Bolsonaro administration is more of the same in that regard. And Lula is just going to have so many problems, but so many problems to administer that he's not going to have time, I think, to think about these issues. How do other countries reflect what's happening in Brazil in terms of their own internal politics? Well, I don't think that happens very much. I think the situation that we currently see in Brazil has no equivalent anywhere in the region. I mean, all countries in Latin America are at this moment polarized. There's no doubt about that. There is certainly a movement amongst the electorate to vote out incumbents. That there's no doubt about that either. But there is no pink tide. I think there's been kind of an effort, at least that we see in the media, of trying to tell the story of a pink tide because of the elections in Chile and the elections in Colombia and previously the elections in Mexico. I don't think those are representative of any kind of preference for the left at all. It's only representative of the fact that people are fed up with their current political systems and with whomever is in power at that point in time. And so they vote them out and they vote somebody else in. And in Brazil, that is the situation in a sense, but not exactly, because we have seen, as I was stressing before, and Richard before me, that Bolsonarismo is alive and well. So even if Bolsonaro does get voted out, he still enjoys a large chunk of support. It's not as if if he leaves office, he's going to leave with still a large chunk of support and a large chunk of rejection, which is the result of polarization. And his movement is everywhere. So I think that's the main message there.
Thank you so much, Monica. Richard, we'll go to you.
Well, echo what Monica said about the pink tide. Certainly no pink tide, I don't think, at the moment. And I'd echo also what she says about the environment. I mean, it's clearly going to be a priority for Lula to try to revamp IBAMA and ICMBio, these state agencies that very successfully, it must be said, during his first 2 administrations, tackled the problem of deforestation. He's clearly going to try and do that. It is going to be difficult to find the money, to be honest. It's going to be difficult politically because clearly they have, as Monica said, been taken over by folk loyal to the chief. Now, I think one interesting parallel with Brazil in the region that I draw to people's attention is what happened early last month in Chile, when polls predicted that the new constitution would be approved in a plebiscite or only narrowly rejected. And the rejection, essentially a vote rejecting a left-wing constitution, was by 25 points. So in a way, what we had in Chile was the same kind of shy right-wing sentiment that didn't appear in the polls. And my suspicion, if we go back to the polling, is that a lot of people who vote for Bolsonaro or vote rechazo in Chile, they don't actually bother replying to polls, and they don't answer honestly. And that the polling industry has got to grapple with that, because clearly in both those examples, we saw a bit of this actually in the Brexit poll in the UK. We saw a bit in the Trump election in 2016, where the polls thought that Hillary Clinton would win. The polls thought that we would stay in the European Union. And that happens. And people don't necessarily, these views that are considered to be not respectable people, and if the people have them, they don't necessarily declare them. And I think that's something we're going to have to take into account, particularly over the next few weeks, when we're going to get polls about the runoff. And who knows whether they're right or not.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Richard. Mansueto, we'll close with you. So any final comments you have either about regional relations or anything else you'd like to add?
Not much. Brazil has many challenges ahead. You're in the middle of a strong polarization. Everybody thought that this election, this will finish. It's quite the opposite. I think, as Monica and Richard stressed, we're in the middle and continue wave of polarization that will continue. This election to 2022 was not much different from 2018. So, and in order to approve important reforms, we need dialogue. We need, different political parties debating with each other in a very calm way, how, to reach compromise in order to make important reforms that the country still needs to approve to have a more sustainable growth. So we have many challenges ahead. Brazil is not much different from what is happening all over the world, including Latin America. But let's see. At the end, how this will evolve. At least, the starting point is better than you're expecting 2 years ago, because 2 years ago, we're expecting to finish this government with a debt to GDP around 94% of GDP. And it will be 77. We can screw up, or we can make things work. It's a big challenge ahead, but let's hope that we improve the political debate and move forward. But again, there's many open questions ahead.
Thank you so much, Mansueto, and thank you to all of you for participating and raising these great points, both about the need for dialogue to identify, what kind of progress needs to be made, and also really understand the magnitude of the obstacles to progress, and, look at what the track record is of Brazilian politics over the last administration and see how strong these trends are. They're not going away anytime soon. So as the second round of the election approaches, we'll see how Brazilians are able to try to move through this. And once more, thank you again for providing you guys' insights, and we'll stay in touch.